The night he told me to leave the house did not arrive with thunder or warning. It came quietly, dressed like every other evening we had ever shared. The lights were low, the television murmured in the background, and the air still smelled faintly of dinner. For years, this house had been my shelter, the place where I let my guard down. That was what made his words land so hard. "You need to pack a bag," he said, not looking at me. "You can't stay here tonight." At first, I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because my mind refused to accept what it was hearing. Home is where you argue, reconcile, and sleep angry if you have to. Home is not a place you are suddenly dismissed from like a guest who overstayed their welcome. I asked him what he meant, expecting clarification, an apology, or at least an explanation that made sense. He repeated himself, slower this time, as if volume or patience would turn confusion into compliance. In that moment, safety flipped into something unrecognizable. The walls that once felt steady now pressed inward. The couch where I had cried before suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else. I realized how fragile security is when it depends on another person's mood. One sentence was all it took to turn familiarity into exile. My heart started racing, but my body felt strangely calm, as if it didn't believe the danger yet. I scanned his face for emotion, anger, fear, guilt, anything human. There was none. His voice stayed even, almost rehearsed. That scared me more than shouting ever could. Rage would have meant emotion. This sounded like a decision already made. I asked the obvious question, why? He avoided my eyes and muttered something about space and needing time. The words were vague, empty, the kind people use when they don't want to be questioned. Space from what? Time for what? I had been here this morning. I had folded laundry, answered emails, watered the plants. Nothing about the day suggested I would be erased by nightfall. As I stood there, trying to understand, disbelief gave way to humiliation. Being told to leave your own home does something sharp to your dignity. It shrinks you and hardens you at the same time. I felt both too small and dangerously alert. My mind began cataloging details I had never paid attention to before, the way his jaw tightened, the way his phone lit up on the table and he quickly turned it face down. I walked through the house slowly, touching door frames, light switches, the edge of the kitchen counter, as if I were saying goodbye without permission. Each step carried the weight of years I had invested here. This wasn't just a house. It was proof of my presence, my labor, my trust. And now I was being asked to abandon it without protest. The silence grew heavier the longer I moved. Even the familiar creaks of the floor sounded different, like they were witnessing something they couldn't stop. I realized how quickly a place can turn on you when the person beside you decides it no longer belongs to you. Comfort dissolved into uncertainty with every breath I took. When I reached the bedroom, I noticed something off. A drawer was slightly open. Papers that were usually stacked neatly were missing. At the time, I couldn't name why that detail lodged itself in my chest, but it did. This wasn't an emotional outburst. This was preparation. I packed mechanically, my hands moving while my thoughts raced. Part of me wanted to beg, to demand answers, to refuse. Another part understood that staying would only make me smaller. As I zipped the bag, I realized the command to leave wasn't about tonight. It was about control, about removing me from a space where I might notice things, ask questions, or remember too much. Fear followed me through every room, but so did clarity. Something had shifted beneath the surface long before this night, and I had simply been living above it, unaware of the cracks spreading quietly underneath my feet. That awareness settled deep and refused to leave. I paused at the door and looked back one last time, memorizing the shape of the hallway and the silence hanging in it. He stood still, watching, as if waiting for a process to complete. That image followed me outside, where the air felt colder and less forgiving. Standing there, keys in my hand, I understood something clearly for the first time that night. People don't erase you from your own home unless they're trying to hide something. And whatever he was hiding, it had already begun to surface completely for me then. When you're ready, send section 2 and I'll continue. Same precision, same tension, no skipping ahead. Before it became the place I was told to leave, this house was where I learned how to exhale. I still remember the first day we walked through the front door together, keys cold in my palm, sunlight spilling across the floor like a welcome. The rooms were empty then, but they felt full of possibility. We stood in the middle of the living room and talked about where the couch would go, where we'd hang pictures, how this would finally be the place where life slowed down instead of constantly asking for more. In those early days, the house felt like proof. Proof that we were building something real. Proof that the struggles before it had meant something. Every sound was comforting. The hum of the refrigerator at night, the soft click of the thermostat, the way the stairs creaked in the same spot every time. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and that was enough. We built routines that stitched us into the walls. Morning coffee at the counter, evening dinners eaten too late, weekends spent fixing small things that didn't really need fixing. I learned which windows caught the best light and which corners stayed cold in winter. I learned how he liked the pillows arranged, how he left cabinet doors half open without realizing it. These details felt intimate, like a language only shared by people who planned to stay. Looking back, that sense of belonging was powerful and blinding. When you feel safe, you don't question the ground beneath you. You assume it will hold. I mistook comfort for certainty and familiarity for truth. The house reinforced that illusion. Every shared laugh echoed reassurance back at me. Every quiet night felt like confirmation that we were solid. But even then, there were moments that didn't quite fit, like shadows passing across a room you don't fully notice until later. Small things, easily dismissed things. A conversation that ended too abruptly. A door closed when it didn't need to be. A change in tone I explained away as stress or exhaustion or life being difficult for a while. Peace is a powerful excuse when you want to keep it. I told myself that no relationship is seamless, that partnership means compromise, patience, and overlooking imperfections. That belief made me generous to a fault. I smoothed over discomfort before it could form into questions. I adjusted myself instead of examining what felt wrong. Belonging taught me to stay quiet. The house absorbed those choices. It became the backdrop for my sacrifices, most of them invisible. I was the one who stayed late cleaning after arguments, convincing myself that tidiness could restore order. I was the one who remembered appointments, tracked bills, noticed when something felt off, and chose not to say it out loud. I didn't see these things as warnings. I saw them as contributions. There were good moments, real ones, that made doubt feel almost disrespectful. Nights we laughed until our stomachs hurt. Conversations that stretched past midnight, heavy and hopeful at the same time. Those memories mattered, and that's what made the later realizations so painful. They weren't lies, but they weren't the whole truth either. Gradually, the house began holding contradictions. Warmth in one room, tension in another. Familiarity mixed with distance. He started spending more time elsewhere, physically or mentally, always with reasonable explanations. Work stress. Phone calls he stepped outside to take. A guardedness that arrived quietly, like furniture rearranged while you're asleep. I noticed how often I adjusted my behavior to avoid friction. I stopped asking certain questions. I stopped lingering in certain rooms when he was already there. I told myself this was normal, that long-term partnership meant learning when to speak and when to let things pass. Blindness, I later realized, often wears the mask of maturity. The house still looked the same, which made it easier to believe everything else was unchanged. Walls don't argue. Floors don't accuse. A familiar space can hide unfamiliar truths because it feels neutral, dependable. I trusted the structure more than my instincts. That trust kept me comfortable and unprepared. Somewhere along the way, the house stopped being shared and started being managed. I didn't name it then, but I felt it. Decisions happened without discussion. Plans were announced, not negotiated. My presence became assumed, then overlooked, then quietly inconvenient. Each shift was subtle enough to ignore on its own. Together, they formed something else entirely. I remember standing in the kitchen one afternoon, sunlight hitting the same spot it always had, and feeling an unexplainable heaviness. Nothing had happened. No argument, no bad news. Just a sudden awareness that I was moving around someone else's gravity. That feeling passed, as feelings do, and I let it go. That was the pattern. Sense something, dismiss it, choose peace. What I didn't understand then was that peace built on avoidance doesn't protect you. It only delays the reckoning. The house, my sanctuary, was slowly becoming a place where I learned how to disappear without leaving. I was still there, still contributing, still believing, but parts of me were being edited out long before I was asked to pack a bag. When I think back now, I see how the nostalgia softens the warning signs. Memory is kind that way. It highlights laughter and blurs discomfort. But the truth is, the cracks were present while the paint was still fresh. I just didn't recognize them as cracks. I thought they were normal wear. That's what makes loss hurt so deeply. Not just what you lose, but what you trusted while losing it. The house didn't betray me. It witnessed everything. It held both the warmth and the silence. And when I was told to leave, it wasn't just the end of my sanctuary. It was the moment I realized how long I had been living inside a version of safety that required me not to see. That realization followed me out the door later, but it was born here, in the memories I once called home. The first lie didn't announce itself. It didn't arrive with shouting or confrontation or anything dramatic enough to demand attention. It came quietly, dressed like a detail too small to matter. That's how most truths slip past you at first, not because they're invisible, but because you're not yet ready to see them. I remember the exact moment it happened, even though at the time I told myself it was nothing. A harmless inconsistency, a misunderstanding. Something easily explained, if I just didn't overthink it. It started with a document left where it shouldn't have been. Not hidden, not displayed, just misplaced. A folded paper on the corner of the desk that I didn't recognize. I wasn't snooping. I wasn't looking for proof of anything. I was doing what I always did, tidying up, maintaining the rhythm of a shared life. When I glanced at it, my stomach tightened before my brain could catch up. Numbers that didn't align. Dates that felt wrong. A name that had never come up in conversation. My first instinct wasn't suspicion. It was loyalty. I immediately began constructing explanations on his behalf. Maybe it was old. Maybe it belonged to work. Maybe I simply didn't understand what I was looking at. I folded it back the way I found it, my heart beating faster than the situation seemed to warrant. I remember feeling faintly embarrassed, as if I had accused him silently of something unfair. Trust does that. It makes doubt feel like betrayal. But my body didn't agree with my logic. There was a low hum of unease that followed me the rest of the day. I tried to drown it out with routine, with productivity, with noise. Still, it lingered, pressing against my ribs. That night when I asked him casually about his day, his answer was smooth, practiced. Too smooth. It didn't match the tension I felt rolling off him. The mismatch was subtle, but it landed. I told myself I was imagining it. Stress can distort perception. Love can make you sensitive. That's what I believed. But belief doesn't silence intuition. It just teaches it to speak more quietly. I noticed how he avoided certain details, how his eyes flicked away a beat too early. Nothing definitive. Nothing I could point to and say, there, that's the lie. Just a growing awareness that his words and his presence were no longer aligned. A few days later, I overheard part of a phone call. Not enough to understand the full conversation, just enough to recognize a shift in his voice. It was lower, controlled, urgent. When he noticed me nearby, the call ended abruptly. He smiled, said it was nothing important. The word nothing settled heavily between us. I nodded, accepted it, even smiled back. But something inside me went still, like an animal sensing danger. That was when I realized how much effort I was spending trying not to know. Every questionable moment came with an immediate defense, an internal debate where trust always won. Barely. I wanted to believe him because belief kept my world intact. Doubt threatened to dismantle everything I thought was solid. The house, the routines, the future I had been planning without realizing it required honesty as its foundation. The lie wasn't confirmed in that moment, but it took shape. It became a shadow I couldn't shake. I started noticing patterns I had once ignored, conversations that looped without answers, information that arrived late or incomplete. I watched myself adapting, choosing words carefully, measuring reactions. That shift scared me. When you start managing the truth instead of trusting it, something essential has already changed. What surprised me most was how physical the awareness felt. My chest tightened when he entered a room. My shoulders tensed when his phone buzzed. I began waking in the middle of the night, heart racing for no clear reason. My body was processing something my mind refused to name. I felt foolish and alert at the same time, caught between wanting reassurance and bracing for impact. I tested reality gently, asking small questions, observing responses. Each answer was plausible on its own. Together, they didn't quite fit. It was like assembling a puzzle where the pieces are beautifully made but belong to different pictures. I kept rearranging them, hoping they would eventually form something recognizable. They didn't. Still, I hesitated. Confrontation felt premature, even reckless. What if I was wrong? What if this was just insecurity masquerading as intuition? The possibility terrified me. I didn't want to damage something real over something imagined. So I waited, telling myself that truth, if it existed, would eventually surface on its own. What I didn't yet understand was that truth rarely storms into your life. It creeps. It tests whether you're paying attention. The first lie I almost missed wasn't a statement, it was a feeling. A quiet internal contradiction between what I was being told and what I was experiencing. That whisper followed me, patient and persistent, preparing me for the moment when silence would no longer be an option. By the time I accepted that something was wrong, it wasn't because I had proof. It was because I had stopped trusting the effort it took to keep believing. And that shift, subtle as it was, marked the beginning of everything that followed. The moment I started asking questions, the air inside the house changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but enough that I felt it in my chest before I could explain it. Curiosity, once harmless, became something sharp. I asked gently at first, framing everything as concern, as care. My voice stayed calm, my words chosen carefully, as if tone alone could protect me. But his responses shortened, clipped at the edges, stripped of warmth. It was the first time I realized that questions themselves could be treated like threats. He didn't explode. That would have been easier to understand. Instead, he tightened. Conversations became transactional. Affection arrived only when I stayed quiet and disappeared the moment I pushed. I noticed how quickly he shifted from charm to coldness, how easily silence replaced reassurance. It felt like standing near a door that could close at any moment. The message was subtle but clear. Curiosity had consequences. When I pressed for clarity, he reframed the issue as my problem. I was overthinking. I was too sensitive. He spoke slowly, patiently, the way someone explains something obvious to a child. That tone unsettled me more than anger ever could. It suggested authority. It suggested that my perception was unreliable. I began doubting not just my conclusions, but my right to ask in the first place. Gaslighting doesn't arrive with cruelty. It arrives with reason. He reminded me of all the ways he had been good, all the times I had been supported. Those facts were real, which made the distortion harder to spot. He used our history like evidence against me, proof that I was imagining things. I felt myself shrinking under the weight of gratitude, unsure how to hold appreciation and unease at the same time. The house mirrored the shift. Rooms felt tighter. Silence lingered longer. I caught myself timing my questions, choosing moments when he seemed relaxed, hopping for honesty before defenses rose. Even then, answers came carefully edited. I started noticing what he didn't say more than what he did. Omissions stacked quietly, forming gaps I couldn't ignore. With every attempt to understand, his grip tightened. Not physically, but psychologically. He began controlling narratives, explaining events before I could question them. If I raised a concern, he reframed it as an attack. If I hesitated, he accused me of mistrust. The irony was suffocating. My search for truth became the very thing he claimed was damaging us. I felt trapped in a contradiction. To stay connected, I had to stay silent. To stay sane, I had to speak. That tension wore me down. I found myself rehearsing conversations in my head, anticipating deflection, preparing for dismissal. Curiosity no longer felt empowering. It felt risky. I understood, finally, that awareness shifts power, and he could feel it slipping. There were moments when fear crept in, quiet but persistent. Not fear of being hurt, but fear of being erased, of losing my footing entirely. His affection became a reward, given sparingly, withdrawn easily. I learned how quickly safety could become conditional. The rules were unspoken, but enforced all the same. I tried grounding myself in reality, writing things down, replaying conversations to confirm what I remembered. That effort felt necessary, like holding onto a railing in the dark. I wasn't losing my mind, but I was being encouraged to doubt it. The danger wasn't obvious. It lived in implication, in the way my questions were met with consequences rather than answers. The more aware I became, the more controlled the environment felt. He monitored reactions, corrected interpretations, dismissed emotions. It was exhausting. I began noticing how much energy it took to remain neutral, how much effort went into not provoking discomfort. That realization terrified me. Love should not require self-erasure. By then, the power dynamic had shifted. He wasn't just avoiding questions, he was punishing them. Withdrawal replaced conversation. Distance replaced intimacy. I understood that this wasn't about misunderstanding anymore. It was about control, about deciding which version of reality was allowed to exist. That understanding marked a turning point. I couldn't unknow it. Awareness, once ignited, doesn't retreat quietly. Even as fear lingered, clarity grew stronger. I realized that asking questions had become dangerous because answers would expose something he needed hidden. And once I saw that, silence was no longer a refuge. It was a warning. Once the shock settled, fear gave way to focus. Being told to leave had stripped something away, but it had also sharpened me. Distance gave clarity. The more I replayed that night, the less it felt emotional and the more it felt deliberate. People don't plan panic. They plan exits. And suddenly, every strange moment I had ignored began lining up with purpose. I started with what I could access without alerting him. Old emails, shared folders, statements I had once glanced at without concern. At first, I told myself I was just trying to understand, not accuse. But understanding quickly turned into something else. Numbers didn't match timelines. Payments appeared where expenses should have been. Accounts I didn't recognize surfaced like ghosts from a life I was never meant to see. Each discovery tightened the knot in my chest. This wasn't one mistake or a misunderstanding. It was a pattern. Transfers timed around conversations where he had reassured me everything was fine. Documents updated quietly, without discussion. I remembered moments when he had insisted on handling things himself, brushing off my offers to help. Independence, I had thought. Responsibility. Now it looked like insulation. The stories he had told me began to unravel under scrutiny. Small inconsistencies grew teeth. Dates shifted. Explanations changed depending on the audience. I started writing things down, mapping conversations against records, memory against evidence. What scared me most wasn't what I found, it was how intentional it all felt. This wasn't chaos. It was management. That's when the urgency of my removal made sense. The house wasn't just a home. It was an archive. A place where mail arrived, where files lived, where habits formed unnoticed. As long as I was there, I was a variable he couldn't fully control. My presence meant risk. My absence meant freedom. I remembered how quickly he had insisted I leave. No discussion, no negotiation, just the command. At the time, it felt cruel. Now it felt calculated. The house had become dangerous, not for me, but for him. Every drawer held potential exposure. Every quiet moment carried the chance of discovery. Fear threaded through my thoughts, but it no longer paralyzed me. It fueled me. I realized how much I had underestimated what people will do to protect the stories they tell about themselves. Truth isn't threatening when it's isolated. It becomes dangerous when someone else starts connecting it. I noticed how his behavior shifted immediately after I left. Messages that were overly polite, offers that felt rehearsed, a sudden willingness to talk things through, paired with pressure to drop certain topics. He wanted closure without consequence, understanding without investigation, peace without truth. The more I learned, the clearer his motive became. It wasn't just about hiding facts. It was about controlling narrative. As long as I stayed confused, displaced, emotionally shaken, I wouldn't have the stability to ask the right questions. Removing me from the house removed context. It disrupted my access and my confidence at the same time. I felt the weight of what I was holding. Knowledge isolates you. Once you see the structure beneath the surface, you can't go back to believing it was accidental. I understood now why affection had become conditional, why questions were punished. Exposure was the real threat. I was never meant to reach this point. There was a moment when I considered letting it go, walking away entirely, starting over somewhere clean, untouched by deception. That temptation was real. Ignorance offers comfort when truth demands courage. But every time I imagined silence, I felt smaller, complicit, like I would be agreeing that my removal was justified. What frightened me most was how easily it could have worked. If I had left quietly, if I had trusted the emotional framing, if I had blamed myself, none of this would have surfaced. The eviction wasn't the end of the story. It was designed to be the end of my involvement in it. Instead, it became the beginning of my clarity. I moved carefully, aware that knowledge changes dynamics. I stopped confronting him directly. I observed. I listened. I documented. Fear returned in waves, fear of retaliation, of escalation, of what might happen if he realized how much I knew. But alongside it grew something steadier: resolve. Truth, I learned, becomes a liability when someone has built their stability on concealment. Every fact I uncovered weakened the illusion he depended on. That was why he wanted me gone. Not because I was emotional. Not because I was difficult. Because I was becoming dangerous in the only way that mattered. The house, once my sanctuary, had turned into evidence. And by forcing me out, he revealed more than he ever intended. The strategy was clear now. Remove the witness. Control the environment. Seal the narrative. But strategies fail when they underestimate awareness. Standing outside that house had felt like exile. Looking back now, I see it as the moment the truth finally had room to breathe. I wasn't removed because I was powerless. I was removed because I was close. And that realization followed me forward, heavy and irreversible, into whatever came next. Leaving the house felt like stepping off solid ground and discovering midair that there would be no soft landing. I didn't leave with closure or clarity. I left with a bag that was too light for the life I had lived there, and a chest that felt too heavy to breathe through. The door closed behind me, and with it went the illusion that leaving meant escape. I was out of the house, yes, but the truth had already followed me. The first nights away were the hardest. Displacement has a way of making even the smallest decisions feel overwhelming. Where to sleep? What to unpack? What version of myself I was supposed to be now? I felt unanchored, like someone had lifted the floor while I was still standing on it. Comfort was gone, replaced by vigilance. Survival became the priority, not healing. But even in that rawness, something unexpected began to take shape. Distance stripped away the noise. Without the house, without his presence controlling the temperature of every room, my thoughts grew clearer. Pain still existed, but it no longer drowned out reason. I could finally hear myself think. I realized how much energy I had spent maintaining equilibrium that wasn't real. Leaving forced me to stop compensating. There was no one to tiptoe around, no moods to manage, no version of peace to preserve at my own expense. That freedom came wrapped in fear, but it was still freedom. Loss and relief coexisted uneasily, each making the other sharper. I stayed tethered to the truth because it had become part of my body. I couldn't unknow what I had uncovered. It lived in my awareness now, shaping how I interpreted every interaction, every message he sent afterward. He spoke as if the separation were temporary, logistical, solvable with time. I listened differently. I heard avoidance where I once heard reassurance. Distance had recalibrated my senses. There were moments I wanted to collapse into grief, to mourn not just the house, but the version of myself who believed in it. That grief was real. I let it exist without letting it decide my next move. Survival doesn't mean numbness. It means choosing which pain you can live with. I chose the pain that came with truth over the comfort that demanded ignorance. Repositioning didn't feel powerful at first. It felt lonely, but loneliness has clarity built into it. Without constant distraction, patterns became obvious. I reviewed what I knew, not obsessively, but methodically. Facts over feelings, evidence over explanations. The truth didn't change when I was away from the house. If anything, it solidified. I noticed how his urgency softened once I was gone. The pressure eased. That alone told me everything I needed to know. My removal had served its purpose for him, but for me, it had done something else entirely. It had returned my perspective. I stopped seeing myself as someone who had been pushed out and started seeing myself as someone who had stepped back to see the full picture. That shift was subtle but transformative. Victims react, seekers observe. I wasn't running anymore. I was repositioning. There was fear, of course. Fear of what might happen if I pushed further. Fear of being wrong. Fear of retaliation in forms I couldn't yet imagine. But fear no longer dictated my silence. It informed my caution. There's a difference. I began rebuilding routines, small and deliberate. Morning walks. Notes written by hand. Conversations with myself I had been postponing for years. Each act grounded me. Each decision reinforced that I still existed, even outside the structure that once defined me. Leaving the house forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth about identity. I had tied too much of myself to a place, to a role, to being needed. Without those anchors, I had to choose who I was without reference. That choice was terrifying and necessary. The truth didn't ask me to be brave all at once. It asked me to stay present, to keep paying attention, to not rush resolution. I learned to sit with uncertainty without filling it with false hope. That patience became its own form of strength. By the time I realized it, the narrative had shifted. I wasn't waiting to be allowed back in. I wasn't asking for permission to understand. I was already moving forward, carrying the truth carefully, deliberately, like something fragile but valuable. Leaving the house had felt like defeat because I thought power lived there. I know better now. Power lives in awareness, in choice, in the refusal to abandon yourself even when everything familiar falls away. The house was behind me. The truth was not. And as I stepped into whatever came next, one thing was clear. I hadn't escaped the story. I had finally stepped into the part where I stopped reacting and started seeking. Silence tempted me in ways I didn't expect, not because it felt right, but because it felt easier. Silence promised rest. It offered the illusion of safety, a way to stop the constant calculating, the vigilance, the careful weighing of every move. If I said nothing, asked nothing, pursued nothing further, the tension might fade. Life could shrink back into something manageable. That possibility hovered in front of me like a door left slightly open. But every time I considered walking through it, something in me resisted. Telling the truth came with consequences I couldn't ignore. Legal risks surfaced quickly once I understood the scope of what I knew. Truth isn't just moral, it's procedural. It requires documentation, language, timelines, and proof. It invites scrutiny. I imagined courtrooms, affidavits, and my own words turned against me. I imagined being painted as unstable, emotional, vindictive. Silence, by comparison, felt merciful. Social backlash loomed just as heavily. People prefer neat stories. Victims who speak disrupt comfort. I knew how easily narratives could be flipped, how quickly sympathy could sour into suspicion. I had already felt it in subtle ways: hesitation in voices, careful phrasing, the unspoken question of whether I was exaggerating. Silence would preserve my image. Truth would complicate it. Then there was personal safety. Not the obvious kind, but the quieter threats that don't announce themselves. Retaliation through pressure, through reputation, through isolation. I had learned how power operates when exposed. It doesn't always strike, sometimes it waits. That uncertainty pressed on me hardest at night, when fear had room to stretch. Staying silent would protect me from all of that, at least temporarily. It would allow me to rebuild quietly, avoid confrontation, reclaim a version of normal. No more digging, no more tension, no more risk. And yet, every time I imagined choosing silence, I felt myself disappear a little. Self-preservation argued convincingly. It listed reasons. It reminded me of exhaustion, of how much I had already lost. It suggested that dignity could be rebuilt privately, that not every truth needs a witness. It wasn't wrong, but it wasn't complete. Because silence came with its own cost, one I couldn't rationalize away. Silence meant agreeing, implicitly, that what happened to me was acceptable. It meant allowing manipulation to stand unchallenged. It meant internalizing the message that my removal was justified, that my questions were the problem, that my awareness was dangerous. I realized something uncomfortable. Silence would not protect me from fear. It would only turn it inward. I had lived too long adapting, minimizing, absorbing discomfort to keep peace. I knew that pattern. Silence felt familiar because it asked me to do what I had always done, make myself smaller to keep things stable. But stability built on erasure is not safety. It's compliance. The choice in front of me wasn't between chaos and calm. It was between integrity and invisibility. I didn't romanticize truth-telling. I wasn't chasing justice or vindication. I just wanted to remain intact. Dignity, I learned, isn't loud. It's the quiet refusal to betray yourself, even when no one is watching, especially then. There were moments I wavered, days when the weight felt unbearable. I questioned my motives, my resilience, my right to disrupt anything at all. Who was I to challenge a story already accepted by others? Who would believe me without undeniable proof? Silence whispered that belief didn't matter if survival was at stake. But survival without self-respect felt hollow. I had already survived the worst of it: confusion, displacement, emotional disorientation. I was still standing. The question wasn't whether I could endure more. It was whether I could live with less of myself. I thought about the person I would become if I chose silence. Careful, guarded, polite, uncomplicated. I imagined carrying the truth like a secret shame instead of what it was, a response to deception. That future felt cramped, airless. It felt like another house I would eventually be asked to leave. Integrity demanded something harder. It demanded patience, preparation, restraint, and courage without certainty. It demanded that I accept being misunderstood, that I risk comfort for clarity, that I choose alignment over approval. I didn't make the decision all at once. It unfolded gradually in small moments of resolve, writing things down instead of deleting them, saving documents instead of ignoring them, saying, "I remember it differently," instead of nodding along. Each act was quiet but cumulative. I understood then that moral choices rarely arrive as dramatic crossroads. They show up disguised as inconvenience, as discomfort, as the decision to keep going when stopping would be easier. The cost of staying silent was becoming clearer than the cost of speaking. Silence would keep me safe, perhaps, but it would also mean surrendering my dignity piece by piece. Truth would cost me more upfront, but it would allow me to remain whole. That realization didn't eliminate fear. It reframed it. Fear became something to navigate, not obey. And once I saw that, the balance shifted. I didn't know yet how far this path would take me or what it would demand. But I knew this much: silence was no longer neutral. It was a choice, and it was one I could no longer afford to make. Truth does not move quietly once it's threatened. The moment it steps out of the shadows, it meets resistance. I learned that quickly. As soon as my silence cracked, even slightly, everything accelerated. Denial came first. Not emotional denial, but strategic denial. Flat, confident, unwavering. He spoke as if repetition could replace reality, as if saying something enough times could erase what existed outside his version of events. He dismissed what I knew before I could fully say it. "That never happened. You're remembering it wrong. You're twisting things." His certainty was unsettling. It wasn't defensive, it was rehearsed. I recognized it then for what it was: an attempt to rewrite history while it was still malleable. The goal wasn't to convince me. It was to establish a competing narrative early enough that doubt would attach itself to me instead of the facts. Deflection followed close behind. When denial failed to stop the conversation, he redirected it. My intentions became the focus, not his actions. Why was I digging? Why couldn't I let things go? Why was I trying to cause problems? Accountability was replaced with accusation. The message was clear: truth was no longer a shared value. It was a threat that needed neutralizing. I felt the shift externally before I fully understood it internally. People who once spoke freely grew cautious. Conversations changed tone. Some avoided me altogether. Others offered sympathy wrapped in distance. Allies were choosing sides, often without saying so out loud. Neutrality vanished. Silence became alignment. What frightened me most was how quickly perception hardened. He spoke confidently, often, and to the right people. I spoke carefully, deliberately, and far less. Confidence travels faster than caution. I watched as versions of the story took root, versions where I was unstable, bitter, exaggerating. The truth didn't disappear, but it had to fight for oxygen. The danger escalated from emotional to structural. I received messages that felt harmless on the surface but carried an edge underneath. Warnings disguised as concern. Suggestions framed as advice. I was encouraged to be careful, to think about consequences, to protect myself. No one said stop, but everyone implied it. Legal implications surfaced next, sharp and sobering. Words like liability, exposure, and risk entered the conversation. I realized how easily truth could become a weapon if mishandled, how quickly morality could be reframed as recklessness. The system doesn't reward honesty, it rewards preparation. I had to learn fast. What surprised me most was my own reaction. Fear surged, yes, but so did clarity. The intensity of the resistance confirmed what denial never could. People don't fight what doesn't matter. They don't mobilize resources, narratives, and allies to defend nothing. The truth was doing exactly what truth does when it threatens power. It was destabilizing it. He became more visible, more vocal, more present everywhere I was. His story gained polish. Mine gained scrutiny. I understood then that accountability feels like attack to those who have never been questioned. Every fact I held forced him to work harder to maintain control. The truth was no longer passive. It was active, and it was expensive. I had moments of panic, moments when the weight of it all pressed so hard I considered retreat. Life felt smaller, tighter, watched. I wondered if integrity was worth this level of exposure, if dignity could survive being publicly doubted. Those thoughts were real, and they were heavy. But something else happened alongside the fear. I stopped feeling confused. The gaslighting lost its power once I saw the pattern. The rewriting of history became predictable. I could trace it, anticipate it. That predictability gave me footing. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was responding. I began choosing my battles carefully. I didn't argue every falsehood. I documented instead. I didn't chase validation. I built consistency. The truth doesn't need to be loud to be effective. It needs to be stable. Still, consequences came. Relationships changed permanently. Doors closed. Opportunities dissolved without explanation. I felt the cost in real time. Truth extracts payment in currency you didn't know you'd have to spend: reputation, comfort, ease. But it also revealed something else. Quiet support emerged from unexpected places. People who didn't speak publicly but showed up privately. Their presence mattered. It reminded me that power structures are loud, but integrity often moves in whispers. The conflict reached a point where avoidance was no longer possible. The truth had disrupted the balance. There was no returning to neutrality. I had crossed a threshold, and the only direction left was forward. I understood then that accountability isn't about punishment. It's about exposure. And exposure feels violent to systems built on concealment. That's why the truth fought back so hard, because it was being fought. Standing in the middle of it, I realized something fundamental. This wasn't just about what he had done. It was about who controlled reality. And once that question is asked, everything changes. I didn't win, I didn't lose, I endured. And endurance in moments like this is its own form of resistance. The truth didn't come without consequence, but neither did silence. At least this way, I remained aligned with myself. As the noise intensified, I felt something unexpected beneath the fear. A steadiness. The knowledge that whatever came next, I would face it awake, not erased. The truth was no longer just something I held. It was something I stood in. There is a strange moment that comes after the storm, when nothing is actively breaking anymore, but nothing will ever be the same. That was where I found myself, standing in the aftermath, surrounded by evidence of change that could not be undone. The truth had surfaced. It had been acknowledged in ways both public and quiet, and yet the silence afterward felt heavier than the noise that came before it. I was no longer invisible. People knew. Not everyone knew everything, but enough had shifted that the narrative could no longer pretend I had simply vanished on my own. My absence now had context. My departure had meaning. And with that came a new kind of exposure. Some looked at me with curiosity, some with respect, some with discomfort. Recognition is not always comforting, but it is grounding. It confirms you existed. The private fallout was harder. Loss doesn't announce itself when it's done doing damage. It lingers. Relationships I thought might survive fractured permanently. Others changed shape, becoming distant, cautious, or conditional. I learned who needed certainty more than truth, who preferred stability over integrity. Letting go of those connections hurt more than I expected, even when I knew it was necessary. There were moments I wanted reassurance, from him, from the house, from anyone who could confirm that what I endured had been real. That instinct surprised me. Even after everything, part of me still wanted acknowledgement from the very places and people that had failed me. Healing doesn't happen all at once. It moves in layers. But something inside me had shifted. I noticed it in the way I spoke, in the way I held eye contact, in the way I stopped explaining myself when no explanation was owed. I wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. I wasn't trying to win. I was simply standing where I had once been pushed away, no longer asking permission to exist. The fear that once governed my decisions had not disappeared, but it had lost authority. It no longer dictated my silence or shaped my posture. Pain still surfaced unexpectedly, in memories, in ordinary moments, but it didn't collapse me. I could carry it without letting it steer. That distinction mattered. I thought often about the night I was told to leave, about how small I felt standing at that door. How unsure, how easily erased. That version of me hadn't been weak, she had been unprepared. She had trusted a structure that wasn't built to hold her. I honored her now by refusing to disappear again. The house no longer held power over me. It existed as a place I once lived, not a symbol I needed to reclaim. I didn't need to step inside it to prove anything. I carried my grounding with me now. Home had shifted from location to alignment, from walls to self-definition. Public acknowledgement didn't feel like victory. It felt like closure's distant cousin, something adjacent but not the same. Closure implies neatness. This wasn't neat. It was real, messy, permanent, but it was mine. I noticed how often people mistook strength for the absence of pain. They would say things like, "You seem so strong," as if strength meant I no longer hurt. The truth was simpler and harder. I hurt, and I stood anyway. Strength didn't replace fear. It stood beside it and refused to move. There was a quiet pride in that realization. Not arrogance, not triumph, just steadiness. I didn't need to rewrite the past to survive it. I didn't need to deny what happened or minimize its impact. I could hold the full story without being swallowed by it. Being unmovable didn't mean being rigid. It meant being rooted. I knew where I stood, even when others tried to shift the ground beneath me. I no longer adapted to fit narratives that required my disappearance. I no longer accepted roles that demanded silence as the price of belonging. The aftermath taught me something essential about power. Power isn't always loud. Sometimes it's simply the refusal to retreat, the decision to remain visible in spaces where you were once unwelcome, the courage to exist without defense. I grieved what was lost, the future I once imagined, the version of safety I believed in. That grief mattered. It deserved space, but it no longer defined me. It had become part of my story, not the whole of it. Standing there, metaphorically, emotionally, fully, I understood the contrast clearly. I was no longer the person who could be removed without consequence. I had stepped into myself fully, without apology. Erasure had failed. And in that failure, something powerful emerged. Not revenge, not vindication, presence. I stood where I was told to disappear, not to prove a point, but because I belonged there, in my own life, in my own truth, in my own name. That was the transformation. That was the moment fear loosened its grip. What came next would matter, but whatever it was, I would meet it standing. I didn't take the house with me when I left. I didn't take the keys, the routines, or the version of the future I once believed was guaranteed. Those things stayed behind, anchored to a place that no longer belonged to me. But when I look honestly at what I carried forward, I understand now that what I kept mattered more than what I lost. At first, that realization came slowly. Loss is loud in the beginning. It dominates the senses, demanding attention, replaying memories like evidence of what no longer exists. I mourned the familiar, the way the morning light used to fall across the floor, the comfort of knowing where everything was, the identity I had built around being rooted there. That grief was real, and I didn't rush it away. Letting go doesn't mean pretending something didn't matter. But as time stretched forward, I began noticing what hadn't been taken from me. My voice was still intact. It had been tested, doubted, challenged, but it survived. I could still speak, still name what happened without shrinking. That mattered more than any possession I left behind. A house can shelter you, but a voice protects you. I also took the truth, not as a weapon, not as a badge, but as a grounding force. Truth doesn't always bring peace, but it brings alignment. It allowed me to stop negotiating with myself. I no longer had to soften memories or question my perceptions to make them more acceptable. What happened existed, regardless of who was uncomfortable with it. Carrying that truth freed me from the exhausting labor of denial. There was a time when I believed keeping the peace was the highest form of maturity. I see now how often peace is confused with compliance. Comfort can be seductive. It offers predictability, familiarity, and the illusion of safety. But comfort built on silence comes at a cost. It asks you to leave parts of yourself behind. I learned that lesson the hard way. What I took with me was discernment. I learned to recognize the difference between love that expands you and love that requires you to disappear. Between belonging that welcomes your full self and belonging that tolerates you only when you're quiet. Those distinctions became non-negotiable. They reshaped how I chose people, spaces, and futures. I took resilience too, though I didn't recognize it at first. Resilience isn't the absence of breaking. It's the willingness to rebuild with honesty instead of nostalgia. I rebuilt slowly, deliberately, with fewer illusions and stronger boundaries. That process wasn't glamorous, but it was real. And reality, I discovered, is sturdier than fantasy. There were moments when I missed the simplicity of ignorance, when knowing less would have meant hurting less. But ignorance is temporary comfort. It fades the moment reality asserts itself. What I gained instead was self-trust. I learned that my instincts are not liabilities. They are information. Ignoring them had cost me far more than listening ever did. I didn't walk away unmarked. I carry memories that still ache when they surface unexpectedly. Certain sounds, phrases, or silences can still tighten my chest. Healing didn't erase those responses. It taught me how to move through them without losing myself. Pain no longer dictated my direction. It simply reminded me where I'd been. What surprised me most was how liberation arrived quietly. There was no triumphant moment, no dramatic release, just a growing sense of space inside myself. Space where fear used to live. Space where justification once crowded out clarity. Liberation didn't announce itself. It settled in. I began asking different questions, not about what I had lost, but about what I wanted to build next. About the kind of life that wouldn't require me to stay silent to belong. About the boundaries that would protect my future instead of shrinking it. Those questions felt hopeful, not heavy. They pointed forward. The house had represented security once. Now I understood that true security isn't tied to ownership or proximity. It's tied to integrity, to knowing you can leave any place without leaving yourself behind. That knowledge travels with you. It becomes a foundation no one else can revoke. I think about the version of me who believed staying quiet would keep everything intact. I don't judge her. She was doing the best she could with what she knew. But I'm grateful I didn't remain her. Growth required discomfort. It required choosing principles over possessions, even when the possessions felt like proof of success or stability. If there's anything this journey taught me, it's that loss isn't always subtraction. Sometimes it's clarification. Losing the house stripped away illusions I had mistaken for safety. In their absence, I gained something sturdier, self-definition. I get to decide who I am now without negotiating my worth. I carry that lesson with me everywhere. It shapes how I listen, how I speak, how I stay. It reminds me that comfort is optional, but integrity is essential. That silence can be soothing, but truth is sustaining. That survival is not the same as living aligned. I didn't keep the house, but I kept my future. I kept my ability to stand in my own story without apology. I kept the knowledge that when something asks you to disappear to maintain its stability, it was never stable to begin with. And maybe that's what I hope lingers for anyone listening. Not the specifics of my loss, but the invitation hidden inside it. To examine the places where comfort demands too much. To notice where silence feels safer than honesty, and ask why. To remember that leaving isn't always failure. Sometimes it's the first act of choosing yourself. What I took with me can't be measured, photographed, or reclaimed by anyone else. It doesn't sit in a room or wait behind a locked door. It lives in alignment, in voice, in the quiet confidence of knowing I didn't abandon myself when it mattered most. That, in the end, was worth everything I left behind.